Topic 1. The Vanishing Honeymoon. October 14th, 1978. The autumn air in Valley City County, Illinois, carried the sweet scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from farmhouse chimneys. Michael Brennan adjusted his tie in the rear-view mirror of his powder-blue Ford Granada, stealing glances at his bride of 3 weeks. Patricia sat beside him, her auburn hair catching the last rays of sunset as they drove home from Romano's Italian restaurant, where they'd celebrated their first-month anniversary with cheap Chianti and dreams that seemed as endless as the cornfields stretching beyond the headlights. The couple had everything ahead of them. Michael, 24, worked at the grain elevator just outside town, his calloused hands already showing the promise of a man who understood honest work. Patricia, 22, taught second grade at Valley City Elementary, where the children adored her gentle way of explaining why leaves changed color and how caterpillars became butterflies. They'd moved into a modest 2-bedroom house on Elm Street, painting the kitchen yellow together just the weekend before, laughing as they got more paint on each other than the walls. Nobody in Valley City locked their doors in 1978. Crime was something that happened in Chicago, not in a town where the biggest excitement was the annual Corn Festival and high school football games that drew half the population every Friday night. The Brennans represented everything good about small-town America: young love, simple pleasures, and the unshakable belief that tomorrow would always come. But at 9:47 p.m., according to the last receipt found in Michael's wallet, their Ford Granada pulled out of Romano's parking lot for the last time anyone would see them alive. The drive home should have taken 18 minutes along County Road 47, a straight stretch of asphalt bordered by harvested fields and the occasional farmhouse porch light. Patricia had called her mother earlier that evening, promising to stop by Sunday after church to help with canning the last of the season's peaches. When Deputy Sheriff Tom Weber found the car at 6:15 the next morning, it sat abandoned on a gravel service road 3 miles from their house, driver's door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The keys dangled from the ignition, engine cold, headlights dim and yellowing in the morning mist. Patricia's purse lay on the passenger seat, her lipstick and compact mirror scattered across the floor as if someone had searched through it hastily. Michael's wallet remained untouched in the glove compartment, $43 still folded inside. But it was the tire tracks that haunted Weber for decades afterward. Deep grooves in the soft earth showed where another vehicle had pulled up behind the Granada, close enough that the drivers could have spoken through open windows. The tracks suggested a larger vehicle, possibly a pickup truck, that had arrived after the Brennans stopped, or had forced them to stop. The impressions led from the gravel road toward the tree line, then simply vanished where the ground turned hard and rocky. Weber, a 28-year veteran who'd seen his share of domestic disputes and Saturday night bar fights, had never encountered anything like this. The scene felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. Too clean, too deliberate. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing. Just 2 people who had simply vanished from their car as if the October darkness had swallowed them whole. The morning sun revealed one more detail that would torment investigators for decades. Patricia's wedding ring, still warm to the touch, sitting on the dashboard where she would never have placed it willingly. Topic 2. The search that never was. Sheriff Frank Kowalski had run Valley City County's law enforcement for 16 years, and his department consisted of himself, 2 full-time deputies, and a part-time dispatcher who worked weekends. When Tom Weber radioed in about the abandoned Granada, Kowalski's first instinct was to treat it as a domestic situation that would resolve itself by dinner time. Young couples fought. Young couples made dramatic gestures. Young couples usually came home when they got hungry or cold. The department's entire investigative toolkit fit in a cardboard box. A Polaroid camera with a sometimes working flash, a magnifying glass that Kowalski had inherited from his predecessor, and a fingerprinting kit that had gathered dust since 1973. The county allocated $847 annually for criminal investigation supplies, barely enough to keep their single patrol car running and the office coffee pot filled. When Michael's brother Davis arrived at the sheriff's office that afternoon, demanding answers about his missing family members, Kowalski offered reassurances that felt hollow, even as he spoke them. "These things usually work themselves out," he told Davis, not meeting his eyes. "Young folks sometimes need space to figure things out." But the wedding ring bothered him. Patricia Brennan had been raised Catholic, a tended saint, Mary's every Sunday since childhood. Taking off her wedding ring would have required more than a simple marital spat. By the third day, with no sign of Michael and Patricia, Kowalski reluctantly called in the Illinois State Police. Detective Ray Hartman arrived from Springfield in a sedan that looked impossibly sophisticated next to the county's aging patrol vehicles. Hartman spent 2 hours at the scene, photographing the tire tracks and collecting soil samples that would sit in evidence bags for the next 41 years without ever being properly analyzed. The detective interviewed Romano's staff, but the restaurant had been busy that Friday night, and nobody remembered anything unusual about the young couple's behavior. The owner, Giuseppe Romano, recalled serving them the house special, noted that they'd seemed happy, maybe a little tipsy from the wine. "They left together," he kept repeating, as if saying it enough times might bring them back. Hartman's report, filed on October 23, 1978, concluded that Michael and Patricia Brennan had likely left voluntarily, possibly due to marital difficulties or financial pressures unknown to family members. The case was classified as a missing persons investigation rather than a potential homicide, effectively guaranteeing it would receive minimal resources and attention. Within a month, the tire track photographs had been misfiled in the wrong cabinet. The soil samples were stored in the basement of the courthouse, where a leaky pipe would eventually contaminate half the evidence boxes from that era. The Brennans' Ford Granada was released to the family after a cursory examination, then sold to a junkyard in Peoria, where it was crushed into a cube of metal no bigger than a refrigerator. Sheriff Kowalski retired in 1985, carrying the weight of the Brennan case like a stone in his chest. On his last day, he pulled the thin file from the cabinet and stared at Patricia's wedding ring, still sealed in its evidence bag. He'd kept it in his desk drawer for 7 years, unable to explain why he couldn't bring himself to return it to her family. The case that should have launched a massive search effort instead became a cautionary tale about the limitations of small-town law enforcement in an era before DNA analysis, computer databases, and coordinated multi-jurisdictional investigations. Topic 3. Families left in limbo. The Brennan family kitchen had always been the heart of their farmhouse, where Mary Brennan served Sunday dinners for 23 people and where the aroma of fresh bread could draw neighbors from half a mile away. But in the weeks following Michael and Patricia's disappearance, the kitchen became a command center for a search that consumed every waking moment of their lives. Mary transformed her dining room table into a makeshift headquarters, covering its polished surface with maps of Illinois marked in red ink, telephone directories with numbers circled in desperate hope, and photographs of Michael and Patricia that she'd had printed at the pharmacy in town. Davis Brennan drove 3 hours to Chicago every weekend, visiting hospitals, homeless shelters, and police stations, carrying a manila envelope filled with missing person flyers that he'd photocopied at his own expense. The Sullivan family, Patricia's parents, mortgaged their house to hire a private investigator from Springfield. Robert Sullivan had worked 30 years at the grain processing plant, saving every penny for his daughter's college education and her future. Now that future had vanished, and he was spending his retirement fund on a man named Eddie Kowalski, who claimed to specialize in missing persons cases, but whose only qualification seemed to be a cousin's connection to the state police. Kowalski drove a rusted Buick and wore suits that smelled of cigarettes and desperation. He charged $50 a day plus expenses, promising breakthrough leads that never materialized. He followed up on reported sightings in Missouri, Iowa, and Wisconsin, each one requiring another payment, another extension of hope that inevitably collapsed into bitter disappointment.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
A young couple matching their description had been seen at a diner in Cedar Rapids. A woman with auburn hair had been spotted at a bus station in St. Louis. None of the leads proved valid, but each false hope reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Patricia's mother, Janet Sullivan, stopped sleeping through the night in November 1978. She would sit at her kitchen window at 3 in the morning, staring down the gravel road that led to town, convinced that she would see headlights approaching, and her daughter would walk through the door with some reasonable explanation for where she'd been. The rational part of her mind knew this was impossible, but grief had its own logic that defied reason. The families organized search parties every weekend through the spring of 1979, walking through cornfields and woods, calling Michael and Patricia's names until their voices gave out. Volunteers from St. Mary's Catholic Church joined them, along with members of the local VFW and high school students who remembered Patricia as their favorite teacher. They searched abandoned barns, old quarries and creek beds, finding nothing but discarded farm equipment and the occasional animal skeleton bleached white by weather and time. By Christmas of 1979, the volunteer searches had dwindled to family members only. The community's initial surge of support had gradually faded as people returned to their own lives, their own problems. The Brennans and Sullivans found themselves increasingly isolated, their obsession with finding Michael and Patricia becoming a source of uncomfortable silence at church gatherings and town festivals. Mary Brennan began calling the sheriff's office every Monday morning, asking if there had been any developments over the weekend. Sheriff Kowalski's responses grew shorter and less encouraging with each call. "We're still investigating, Mrs. Brennan," became, "We'll call you if anything comes up," which eventually became uncomfortable pauses, followed by promises to look into it. The private investigator disappeared in March 1980, taking the Sullivans' final payment and leaving behind only a forwarding address that led to an empty post office box in Peoria. Robert Sullivan drove to the address anyway, finding a strip mall with a vacant office space and a landlord who remembered a man matching Kowalski's description, but had no idea where he'd gone. The families had spent their savings, exhausted their emotional reserves, and alienated friends who grew tired of hearing about the case, yet they continued searching, because stopping meant accepting that Michael and Patricia were truly gone forever. Topic 4. The Cold Trail. Winter settled over Valley City County like a heavy blanket, covering the tire tracks and scent trails that might have led investigators to answers. By February 1979, the Brennan case had been relegated to a manila folder in Sheriff Kowalski's bottom desk drawer, pulled out only when family members called or when guilt prompted him to review the sparse evidence one more time. The case file contained 17 pages of reports, witness statements and photographs that told a story with too many missing chapters: Giuseppe Romano's statement about the couple's final dinner, Tom Weber's crime scene report describing the abandoned car, photographs of tire tracks that led nowhere, Patricia's wedding ring in its evidence bag, catching fluorescent light like a small accusation every time Kowalski opened the drawer. What the file didn't contain haunted him more than what it did. No one had interviewed the residents of the 3 farmhouses visible from County Road 47. No one had checked with the dispatcher at Miller's Trucking Company, whose depot sat 2 miles from where the Granada was found, to see if any of their drivers had noticed unusual activity that Friday night. The phone records from Romano's restaurant had never been requested, and the guest list from the Brennans' wedding 3 weeks earlier had never been reviewed for potential suspects. Detective Ray Hartman from the state police had returned to Springfield with promises to follow up on the soil samples and fingerprints collected from the scene. His subsequent reports, filed monthly through the summer of 1979, contained increasingly generic language about ongoing investigation and pursuing all available leads. By autumn, the reports stopped coming altogether. The truth was that Illinois in 1979 was overwhelmed with violent crime. Chicago's murder rate had reached historic highs, and state resources were focused on urban gang violence, drug trafficking, and organized crime. A missing couple from a rural county with no evidence of foul play simply couldn't compete for attention against drive-by shootings and drug-related homicides that generated headlines and political pressure. Martha Brennan, Michael's sister, worked as a secretary at the county courthouse and had access to information that the family wasn't supposed to see. She discovered that the case had been reclassified in September 1979 from active investigation to inactive pending new evidence. The change meant that no resources would be dedicated to finding Michael and Patricia unless someone delivered a breakthrough lead directly to the department. Local residents had seen things that night. things they never reported, because they seemed insignificant at the time, or because they didn't trust their own perceptions. Henrietta Walsh, who lived on the farm nearest to where the car was found, had been awakened around 10:30 p.m. by what sounded like a truck backfiring several times in quick succession. She'd looked out her bedroom window, but seen only darkness and the distant glow of headlights moving through the trees. By morning, she'd convinced herself it had been part of a dream. Carl Martinez, a long-distance trucker who regularly drove County Road 47 on his route between Chicago and St. Louis, remembered seeing a pickup truck parked on the shoulder near the service road sometime after 10 p.m. that Friday. The truck's tailgate was down, and someone appeared to be loading or unloading something heavy. Martinez had slowed down, wondering if the driver needed help, but the truck had suddenly pulled away with its lights off, disappearing into the maze of farm roads that crisscrossed the county. Neither Walsh nor Martinez came forward with their observations. In a small community where gossip traveled faster than news, both worried about becoming involved in something that might bring unwanted attention to their families. They told themselves that if the information was important, the police would have asked for it specifically. The case grew cold, not because of a lack of clues, but because of a system unprepared to recognize and pursue them. By 1980, Michael and Patricia Brennan had become another entry in the growing national database of missing persons, their names joining thousands of others who had simply vanished from their lives without explanation. Topic 5. Decades of silence. The 1980s brought changes to Valley City County that nobody could have predicted in 1978. The grain elevator where Michael Brennan had worked closed in 1983, another casualty of the farm crisis that devastated rural Illinois. The building stood empty for years, its rusted silos becoming a landmark that reminded older residents of simpler times when young couples like Michael and Patricia had futures as predictable as the changing seasons. Romano's Italian restaurant survived until 1987, when Giuseppe Romano suffered a heart attack and his children decided not to continue the family business. The building became a hardware store, then a used car lot, then finally a storage facility for farm equipment. Each transformation erased a little more of the last night Michael and Patricia were seen alive, until newcomers to the area had no idea that the nondescript metal building had once been the scene of romantic dinners and anniversary celebrations. Sheriff Frank Kowalski retired in 1985, replaced by his deputy Tom Weber, who had found the abandoned Granada 7 years earlier. Weber inherited the case file along with 24 other unsolved investigations, storing them in a new filing system that gradually pushed the Brennan folder deeper into the archives. When the courthouse was renovated in 1991, many of the old evidence boxes were moved to a basement storage room that leaked during heavy rains, and some files from the late 1970s suffered water damage that made them partially illegible. The families aged into their grief, learning to carry the weight of unanswered questions through birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries that arrived with clockwork cruelty. Mary Brennan developed arthritis in her hands from years of addressing envelopes and making copies of missing person flyers. She kept a photograph of Michael and Patricia on her kitchen table until her death in 1994, turning it face down only when the constant reminder became too painful to bear. Robert Sullivan never stopped believing that his daughter would walk through the door someday with a reasonable explanation for her absence. Even after his wife Janet passed away in 1989, he continued setting 2 place settings at dinner, one for himself and one for Patricia. Neighbors worried about his mental state, but his routine provided the only stability he had left in a world that had taken his daughter and offered nothing in return. The case became local folklore, passed down through generations like ghost stories around campfires. High school students in the 1990s would dare each other to drive out to the service road where the car had been found, parking there at night and listening for sounds that might reveal what had happened to the missing couple. Some claimed to have seen unexplained lights moving through the trees. Others reported hearing voices calling for help, though investigators who responded to these reports never found evidence of anything supernatural. New residents arriving in Valley City County throughout the 1990s and 2000s learned about the Brennan case from longtime neighbors, but the story had evolved through years of retelling. Details became confused, timelines shifted, and facts merged with speculation until the truth was buried under layers of small-town mythology. Some versions had Michael and Patricia fleeing to escape gambling debts. Others suggested Patricia had been pregnant, and the couple had run away to avoid family scandal. None of these theories had any basis in the original investigation, but they provided explanations that were easier to accept than the possibility of random violence in their peaceful community. By 2010, most people who remembered Michael and Patricia personally had either died or moved away. The case existed primarily in archived newspaper articles and the fading memories of a few elderly residents who occasionally mentioned the missing couple when discussing local history. Sheriff Weber, now in his 60s, would sometimes pull out the old file and study the photographs, wondering if there were clues he had missed as a young deputy 30 years earlier. The Brennan case had become what most cold cases eventually become, a mystery that generated more questions than answers, discussed in hushed tones at church socials and high school reunions, a reminder that terrible things could happen even in places where people trusted their neighbors and left their doors unlocked at night. Topic 6. The Discovery. The summer of 2019 brought a drought unlike anything Valley City County had experienced in living memory. Corn crops withered in fields that normally produced some of Illinois' finest grain, and the Sangamon River dropped to levels not seen since the Department of Agriculture began keeping records. Old-timers compared it to the Dust Bowl stories their grandparents had told, watching helplessly as decades of topsoil blew across barren fields. It was the drought that revealed secrets the land had kept hidden for 41 years. Thompson's Quarry, abandoned since the 1960s when the limestone deposits played out, had always been partially filled with groundwater that created a murky pond, popular with local fishermen despite posted no trespassing signs. As the water level dropped through July and August, the pond shrank to less than half its normal size, exposing limestone shelves and debris that had been submerged for decades. On August 23, 2019, a base fisherman named Kevin O'Sullivan was working the shallow water near the quarry's eastern edge when his fishing line snagged on something large and metallic. O'Sullivan, a retired machinist who had moved to Valley City County 5 years earlier to enjoy quieter retirement fishing, initially assumed he had hooked an old piece of mining equipment or a discarded appliance that farmers sometimes dumped in remote locations. When he waded into the ankle-deep water to free his line, O'Sullivan found himself staring at what appeared to be the roof of a car, coated in decades of algae and sediment, but unmistakably automotive in shape. The vehicle sat upright on the quarry floor, as if someone had driven it straight into the water and let it sink. Through the murky water, he could make out the distinctive shape of 1970s American sedan, its chrome bumpers and window frames still visible beneath the biological growth that had claimed the metal surfaces. O'Sullivan called 911 from his cell phone, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what he had found to the dispatcher. Within 20 minutes, Sheriff's Deputy Amanda Fisher arrived at the scene, followed by Sheriff Weber himself, once Fisher radioed that the fisherman's discovery appeared legitimate. Weber, now 58 and graying at the temples, stared at the partially submerged vehicle with a growing sense of dread that he couldn't quite explain. The drought had dropped the water level enough to reveal the car's license plate, though decades of submersion had made the numbers difficult to read. Weber used his radio to request assistance from the Illinois State Police, along with a tow truck capable of pulling a submerged vehicle from 20 feet of water and mud. While they waited for additional resources, he walked the perimeter of the quarry, noting tire tracks in the dried mud that appeared to lead from a service road that connected to the county highway system. Detective Sarah Martinez, from the State Police Major Case Squad, arrived from Springfield that evening, bringing with her a team of crime scene technicians and underwater recovery specialists. Martinez, a 15-year veteran who had worked dozens of cold cases, recognized immediately that they were potentially dealing with more than a simple accident or insurance fraud case. Cars didn't typically end up in abandoned quarries by chance, especially cars that had been reported missing decades earlier. The recovery operation began at dawn on August 24th, using a specialized tow truck and underwater cables to slowly extract the vehicle from its muddy grave. As the sedan emerged from the water, Decades of accumulated sediment and plant growth sloughed away, revealing a powder-blue Ford Granada with Illinois plates and an interior that had been preserved in an aquatic time capsule. Weber felt his stomach tighten as he read the license plate number aloud to Detective Martinez. He had seen those numbers before, written in faded ink on a report that had haunted him for 4 decades. The car that had just been pulled from Thompson's quarry was the same Ford Granada that Michael and Patricia Brennan had been driving the night they disappeared in October 1978. Inside the vehicle, sealed in waterlogged evidence bags that crime scene technicians handled with reverent care, were the personal belongings of 2 people who had vanished from the world on an autumn evening 41 years earlier. The discovery would transform a cold case into an active homicide investigation and reveal secrets that had been buried deeper than anyone imagined. Topic 7. Modern forensics meets old secrets. The Illinois State Police Crime Laboratory in Springfield had capabilities in 2019 that would have seemed like science fiction to investigators in 1978. Detective Sarah Martinez watched through reinforced glass as forensic technicians in sterile white suits carefully processed the interior of the Ford Granada, using tools and techniques that could extract DNA from samples 40 years old and reveal evidence that previous generations of investigators never could have imagined. The car's interior told a story that contradicted everything the original investigation had assumed. Water damage had destroyed much of the upholstery and paper materials, but the sedan's metal frame and harder surfaces had preserved crucial evidence in an anaerobic environment that actually helped maintain forensic materials that might have degraded if exposed to air and weather. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lab's chief forensic pathologist, made the first breakthrough on August 27th while examining what appeared to be fabric fibers embedded in the car's dashboard. Under microscopic analysis, the fibers proved to be fragments of rope, specifically 3-strand manila hemp rope of the type commonly used for farm and construction work in the 1970s. The rope fragments showed evidence of having been cut with a sharp blade rather than frayed through normal wear, suggesting they had been used to restrain someone before being removed hastily. More disturbing was the pattern of damage to the car's interior. The passenger side door handle had been torn completely away from the interior panel, leaving scratches in the metal that suggested someone had fought desperately to escape from inside the vehicle. The scratches matched the pattern that fingernails would make when dragged across painted metal under extreme stress. Luminol testing revealed trace amounts of blood on the passenger seat and floor mat, blood that had survived 4 decades of submersion because it had soaked into fabric fibers that were protected from complete degradation. The breakthrough that would transform the investigation came from an unexpected source. Patricia's purse, which had been found in the original crime scene, had been stored in the evidence room for 41 years. When Martinez requested that it be reprocessed using modern DNA extraction techniques, technicians discovered something that 1978 investigators had missed entirely. Hidden in the purse's inner pocket was a small piece of torn fabric that appeared to have been pulled from someone's clothing during a struggle. The fabric fragment, no larger than a quarter, contained epithelial cells that had been preserved by the dry environment inside the evidence bag. Using polymerase chain reaction amplification, technicians were able to extract a complete DNA profile from the sample, a profile that matched neither Michael nor Patricia Brennan. The unknown DNA belonged to a male, and when run through the combined DNA index system database, it produced no immediate matches among known criminals. However, the DNA profile could be compared against voluntary samples from potential suspects, and Martinez began the delicate process of identifying individuals who had access to the couple on the night they disappeared. The investigation took a new direction when crime scene analysts discovered something even more significant embedded in the car's trunk liner. Microscopic paint chips recovered from the Granada's rear bumper showed evidence of contact with another vehicle, specifically a dark blue or black pickup truck manufactured between 1975 and 1980. The paint transfer pattern indicated that the truck had struck the Granada from behind with considerable force, possibly to disable it or force it off the road. Chemical analysis of the paint revealed trace elements consistent with Ford Motor Company's industrial paint formulations from that era. Digital enhancement of the tire track photographs from 1978 revealed details that had been invisible to investigators using 1970s technology. The tread patterns matched those of Goodyear Wrangler tires, in a size commonly fitted to full-size pickup trucks. More importantly, one of the tires had shown a distinctive wear pattern caused by misaligned front-end components, a pattern that would be unique to a specific vehicle and potentially identifiable even decades later if the truck still existed. The forensic evidence painted a picture of a planned attack rather than a random encounter. Someone had forced the Brennans off the road, restrained them with rope, and transported them in a pickup truck to the quarry, where their car was submerged to hide the evidence. The perpetrator had been methodical and organized, suggesting someone familiar with the local area who understood how to dispose of evidence effectively. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came from analysis of the car's odometer and fuel gauge. The vehicle had been driven approximately 15 miles after leaving Romano's restaurant, far more than the 3-mile distance to where it was originally found abandoned. Someone had driven the Granada around the county for hours before finally disposing of it in the quarry, possibly while Michael and Patricia were still alive and hoping for rescue. Topic 8. The suspect emerges. The DNA profile sitting in Detective Martinez's case file represented more than just forensic evidence. It was a key that could unlock 41 years of secrets if matched to the right suspect.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
Challenge was identifying potential donors from a crime that had occurred before DNA analysis existed, when investigators had never thought to collect biological samples from witnesses or persons of interest. Martinez began with the obvious candidates: individuals who had been questioned during the original investigation, family members who might have had access to the couple, and anyone mentioned in the sparse case files from 1978. The list was disappointingly short, consisting mainly of Romano's restaurant staff and a few customers who had been present the night of October 14th. Most of these individuals were now deceased or had moved away from Valley City County decades earlier. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Martha Brennan, Michael's sister who had worked at the courthouse, had kept detailed personal records of everyone she suspected might have been involved in her brother's disappearance. Her notebooks, maintained obsessively for 20 years before her death in 1999, contained names, dates, and observations that official investigators had never documented. One name appeared repeatedly in Martha's notes: James Davis, who in 1978 had been a 32-year-old construction contractor specializing in farm building projects. Davis owned a blue Ford F-150 pickup truck and had done work for several families in the area, including minor repairs at Romano's restaurant just months before the Brennans disappeared. Martha's notes indicated that Davis had been drinking at Henley's Tavern the night of October 14th and had made comments about the young couple that struck other patrons as inappropriate and aggressive. Davis had never been officially questioned in 1978, despite several witnesses reporting his hostile remarks about Patricia Brennan's appearance and his crude suggestions about what he would like to do to stuck-up college girls like her. The original investigators had dismissed these reports as typical bar talk, not recognizing them as potential indicators of violent intent. In 2019, James Davis was 73 years old and considered one of Valley City County's most respected citizens. His construction company had built half the new houses in the area over the past 4 decades, and he served as a deacon at First Baptist Church. Davis was married to his high school sweetheart, Dorothy, and they had 3 grown children who worked in the family business. His reputation in the community was spotless, built on decades of honest work and charitable contributions. When Detective Martinez approached Davis at his home on September 15, 2019, requesting a voluntary DNA sample to help eliminate him from the investigation, his reaction struck her as unusual. Most innocent individuals were eager to cooperate with efforts to solve a decades-old murder case, especially one that had haunted the community for so long. Davis, however, became agitated and defensive, demanding to know why he was being singled out and insisting that he needed to speak with his attorney before providing any biological samples. The legal process of obtaining a court-ordered DNA sample took 3 weeks, during which Davis's behavior became increasingly erratic. Neighbors reported that he had been seen burning papers in a barrel behind his workshop, despite county ordinances prohibiting open burning during drought conditions. His wife Dorothy told friends at church that James had been having nightmares and walking the floors at night, behavior that was completely out of character for a man known for his steady demeanor and regular habits. On October 6, 2019, the DNA comparison results arrived at the Illinois State Police Laboratory. The genetic profile extracted from the fabric fragment in Patricia Brennan's purse matched James Davis's DNA with a probability of 1 in 7. 2 billion, essentially confirming that Davis had been in direct physical contact with Patricia during the time of her disappearance. The match sent shockwaves through the investigative team and raised profound questions about how a respected community leader had managed to hide his involvement in a double murder for more than 4 decades. Even more disturbing was the realization that Davis had been living among the victims' families all these years, attending the same church services, participating in community events, and maintaining the facade of a peaceful, law-abiding citizen while 2 families had suffered decades of unanswered grief. The DNA evidence was overwhelming, but Martinez knew that building a prosecutable case would require more than genetic matches. She needed to reconstruct Davis's movements on October 14, 1978, and find additional evidence linking him to the crime scene and the disposal of the bodies. Topic 9. The arrest that rocked the town. The arrest warrant for James Davis was signed at 6:47 a.m. on October 23, 2019, exactly 41 years and 9 days after Michael and Patricia Brennan had vanished from County Road 47. Detective Martinez assembled a team that included Illinois State Police investigators, FBI agents specializing in cold cases, and Sheriff Weber, who had requested to be present when the man who had haunted his career for 4 decades was finally taken into custody. Davis's house on Maple Street sat in the heart of Valley City's most established neighborhood, surrounded by mature oak trees and the kind of well-maintained lawns that spoke of generational stability. The white colonial with green shutters looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting, complete with a front porch where Davis and his wife Dorothy had hosted countless church committee meetings and neighborhood gatherings over the years. When the convoy of police vehicles pulled into the driveway at 7:15 a.m., Dorothy Davis was in her kitchen making breakfast, the same routine she had followed for 43 years of marriage. She looked out the window to see her husband of nearly 5 decades being read his rights while their neighbors watched from behind curtains, their phones already buzzing with text messages and social media posts that would spread the news across town within minutes. Davis offered no resistance, as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, but his face had drained of color until he looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. The confident contractor, who had built half of Valley City County's modern infrastructure, was replaced by a frail, elderly man whose hands shook as he was helped into the back of Detective Martinez's unmarked sedan. The news exploded across Valley City like a wildfire in drought conditions. By noon, 3 television news crews had set up on Main Street, interviewing anyone willing to speak about James Davis and the Brennan case. The story dominated local radio stations, where callers expressed everything from shock and disbelief to dawning recognition of behavior patterns they had dismissed as harmless eccentricity. Linda Harris, who had lived next door to the Davis for 15 years, told Channel 7 News that James had always been a little too interested in young women who worked at local businesses, but she had never considered his behavior threatening. Other neighbors recalled incidents that took on sinister significance in light of the arrest. Davis's habit of driving slowly past the high school when classes let out, his unexplained absences during hunting season that sometimes lasted for days, and the soundproof workshop he had built behind his house, where he claimed to restore antique furniture. At First Baptist Church, where Davis had served as deacon for 12 years, Pastor William Thompson struggled to address a congregation torn between loyalty to a long-time member and horror at the allegations against him. The church board held an emergency meeting that evening, voting unanimously to suspend Davis from all leadership positions pending the outcome of his trial. Several members broke down in tears, remembering how Davis had counseled their families through difficult times and contributed generously to mission work and community outreach programs. The psychological impact on Valley City's residents went deeper than simple shock at learning a neighbor was accused of murder. For 41 years, the community had lived with the comforting assumption that whoever killed Michael and Patricia Brennan was an outsider, a transient criminal who had passed through their area and moved on to terrorize other communities. The revelation that the killer had been living among them all along, attending their church services, building their houses, and participating in their civic organizations, shattered fundamental assumptions about safety and trust in small-town America. Dorothy Davis, married to the accused killer for 43 years, found herself suddenly isolated in a community where she had been respected and welcomed for decades. Friends who had shared coffee with her every Tuesday morning at the diner stopped calling. Fellow church members avoided making eye contact during services. The woman who had never missed a church potluck or community fundraiser in living memory became a pariah overnight, guilty only of having shared her life with a man who had apparently hidden monstrous secrets behind a facade of respectability. The arrest that was supposed to bring closure to the Brennan case instead opened new wounds that would take years to heal, forcing an entire community to confront the terrifying possibility that evil could wear a familiar face and smile while keeping unthinkable secrets. Topic 10. Justice after 4 decades. The courtroom in the Valley City County Courthouse had never seen anything like the crowd that gathered for James Davis's arraignment on November 15, 2019. Every seat was filled, with overflow spectators standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway, creating an atmosphere of electric tension that seemed to charge the very air with anticipation and grief that had been building for 4 decades. Davis Brennan, now 68 and walking with a cane, sat in the front row with tears streaming down his weathered face as he looked at the man accused of murdering his brother. Beside him, Patricia's surviving cousin Margaret Sullivan clutched a framed photograph of the missing couple taken at their wedding reception, their young faces radiant with hope and love that had been extinguished just 3 weeks later. Davis entered the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit that seemed to diminish his once imposing presence, transforming the man who had been a pillar of the community into someone who looked every bit of his 73 years. His attorney, Thomas Brennan from Springfield, no relation to the victims despite the shared surname, had advised him to plead not guilty to all charges, but Davis's demeanor suggested a man who had already been defeated by the weight of his own secrets. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney Rebecca Martinez, Detective Martinez's younger sister, who had requested assignment to the case, presented evidence that painted a methodical picture of premeditated murder. The DNA evidence was irrefutable, but it was the circumstantial details that revealed the true horror of what had happened on October 14, 1978. Davis had been at Henley's Tavern that evening, drinking heavily and making increasingly aggressive comments about Patricia Brennan to anyone who would listen. Witnesses who had remained silent for 41 years finally came forward, describing how Davis had become fixated on the young teacher, following her movements around town and making crude remarks about what he would like to do to teach her a lesson. When Davis left the tavern around 9:30 p.m., he had driven directly to County Road 47, where he had waited for the couple to return from their anniversary dinner. The forensic evidence revealed the sequence of events with chilling clarity. Davis had used his pickup truck to force the Granada off the road, then had restrained both victims with rope, before transporting them to a secondary location where the murders had taken place. The car had been driven to Thompson's quarry and submerged to hide the evidence, while the bodies had been disposed of in a location that investigators were still trying to determine. During the trial, which lasted 3 weeks in February 2020, Davis's defense team argued that the DNA evidence could have been transferred innocently, pointing out that Davis had done construction work throughout the county and might have encountered Patricia Brennan in any number of legitimate contexts. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming, supported by witness testimony, forensic evidence, and Davis's own behavior following his identification as a suspect. The most devastating moment came when Dorothy Davis took the witness stand, testifying reluctantly about her husband's behavior in the weeks following the Brennans' disappearance. She described how he had burned clothes and personal items, claiming they were damaged beyond repair. She recalled unexplained scratches on his arms and face that he had attributed to construction work, and his sudden decision to sell his blue Ford pickup truck just months after the couple vanished. On February 28, 2020, after deliberating for 6 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and concealment of a homicide. Davis showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but several family members of the victims collapsed in tears of relief and anguish that justice had finally been served, even if it could never restore what had been stolen from them. Judge Patricia Kowalski, daughter of the original sheriff who had worked the case, sentenced Davis to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that his crimes had not only destroyed 2 young lives, but had inflicted decades of suffering on their families and community. As she spoke, her voice cracked with emotion that reflected the weight of 41 years of unanswered questions finally resolved. The case that had begun with tire tracks leading nowhere had ended with a 73-year-old man being led away in shackles, but the questions it raised about trust, evil, and the secrets that ordinary people carry would linger in Valley City County long after the media attention faded and the courtroom returned to handling routine civil disputes and traffic violations. For those who have followed this case from the beginning, the resolution brings both relief and an uncomfortable awareness of how many other unsolved disappearances might involve perpetrators who continue to live normal lives in plain sight. If you found this investigation compelling, consider subscribing to stay informed about other cold cases that deserve our attention, and share your thoughts about how communities can better protect themselves from predators who hide behind masks of respectability.